Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's webcast with Jasper Snyder. My name is Zina Pagan, ARF's Marketing Manager, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I will go over a few housekeeping items. The audio will be streamed for this. This means that you will be able to hear us throughout your computer speakers. However, if you prefer to use a teleconference option, I will post the information in the chat box. Should you have any questions during the session, please send those to me using the chat box, and I will read them out at the end of the session. This session will be recorded. If you would like to view the recorded event, it will be available on demand within 2 weeks from today. For the best webcast experience, please keep yourself muted and your computer web camera turned off. We are also extending the conversation on social media. If you would like to join us, please use hashtag ARF Webcast. If you're interested in hosting a webcast, please contact me at zina@thearf.org. The ARF has a few events coming up. The ARF's Leadership Lab will be back for our summer session starting tomorrow and will run through September 8th. The topic for this course will be centered around cross-platform measurement. Please check our website for further details on how to register. Also, the ARF is debuting a new series of events this summer called Deep Dives. These events will focus on hot topics affecting our industry. The first one will be hosted on Monday, July 18th, and will feature David Ayuduka from Yahoo, Matthew Trakimas from Twitter, and our very own Horst Stipp. This panel of speakers will discuss all things neuro and creative. If you're interested in either one of these events or other ARF programs, please let me know, and I'd be happy to help you. And without further delay, I present to you Jasper Snyder, ARF's EVP of Research and Innovation of Crossplatform. Jasper, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jasper Snyder, the EVP in the Research and Innovation team here at the ARF. So I'm going to walk you through today the how advertising works today, research that we unveiled at our Rethink conference in March of this year. So to start, we know advertising works. How do we know this? We have extensive scientific and academic proof over many decades showing that it works. Much of this was presented on ARF stages. Much of this is featured in the Journal of Advertising Research. One study that jumps out for many people is the 1989 behavior scan work. And what that study did was to do, hold on a minute, sorry everyone, there's a technical glitch, I'm told.
To share your deck, yeah.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. I wasn't sharing my screen. Let me rewind. Zina.
Thank you.
Apologies, everyone. That's entirely on me. Just bear with us for a second. There's I'm pressing share screen, everyone, but it's not working apparently. So if you could indulge us with a little bit of your patience, would be grateful. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, everyone. Let's start again. So we know advertising works. We've known this for decades. How? Through extensive scientific and academic proof over many decades. One study that looms very large over this entire body of work is the 1989 behavior scan work. It was actually published here in 1995, the Lodish et al., as you see here. And what that study did was two things, basically. It was, first of all, establish or quantify, rather, the long-term impact of advertising as 2 times the short-term impact. And then secondly, it proved very definitively that advertising worked, not only for established brands, but also and particularly for new brands. So we know that advertising works. The question then for today is, how does it work in today's cross-platform world? So is that an academic question or a practical question? It's very much a practical question. The C-suite is still asking us these 2 critical questions. First, do my marketing dollars drive growth in sales? And second, where should I spend my next marketing dollar? There's been a great deal of work in the industry focusing on the ROI and the sales impact and other types of impact of individual platforms. And there has been work looking at the impact of cross-platform advertising too. This is just a selection of some of the studies that exist in that sphere. The challenge to the ARF, however, is that many of these studies, or rather, there are two types of challenge in this type of study. Much of the cross-platform work is not cross-category. So there are studies here which are cross-platform, but predominantly focused on soup, for example, or soft drinks or cereals. Conversely, much of the work which is cross-category in nature is not really cross-platform. It's more focused or has a lens, whether it's a digital lens or a TV lens. So that was the challenge to the ARF, to establish ground truths that are both cross-platform in nature and also cross-category. So how did we do that? Well, the ARF's mantra is collaborate, invest, and do. That's exactly what we did. On February 11 of last year, we convened a group of 40 industry leaders down at GfK's headquarters in Battery Park City here in Manhattan. And what we did, rather than having the typical or usual ARF event where we have a number of presentations and so on, this was literally a roll up your sleeves event where we had these leaders tell us basically what they thought were the key issues at the heart of how advertising works, and help us design the experiments that would help answer the questions that came out of those issues. So we designed the experiments. We invested a huge amount of time and resource into the three experiments that we did over the last year. And obviously, we couldn't have done that alone. We relied on the support of many of the partners that you see in the bottom half of the screen here. So thank you for those of you who are on the phone with us today. So what did we do? Well, we wanted to establish ground truth at scale. So we looked at 5,000 campaigns representing $375 billion in ad spend worldwide across 45 countries, 1,000 brands and sub-brands, and this is very much cross-category, 100 different categories here. So ground truth at scale is what we established, all in the service of these three ground truth experiments. And to talk you through them, first of all, cross-platform ROI, and that's the one we're going to be focusing on today. There are two sister projects. One is focused on creative, looking at that through the neuroscience lens. And then finally, there's a project focused on mobile. Initially, that had focused more on harmonizing mobile metrics. Obviously, we all know that mobile measurement is a hot topic for everyone these days. What that project did, however, was to morph more into a project focused on how to optimize mobile surveys. As more and more people are taking surveys on mobile, the rules that apply to desktop surveys in terms of how long something should be and don't necessarily apply to mobile. So that's what that project focused on. Today, however, we're going to be focusing on cross-platform ROI, and there are 5 key questions that we're going to go through today. First of all, how should I invest across platforms? Second, are there any combinations of platforms that are particularly magical together? Third, do those findings differ by demographic, by age? Fourth, just a tiny little question here of how can I optimize my digital spend? And then fifth, what should my creative strategy be across platforms? So why should the answers to these 5 questions be any different than they were, let's say, 27 years ago when the 1989 work came out, the original How Advertising Works? Well, I'm not blowing the lid off this, but it's because of consumer behavior, which has basically changed drastically on 2 dimensions. The first dimension is place, is geography. So consumers can now access media in places in which they couldn't, or to the same degree as they can these days, whether it's the bed, the bathroom, the commute particularly. So that's the geographical dimension. The second dimension is one of time. So consumers can access media or more media at more times of the day than they ever could before. So paradigm shift in terms of how consumers consume media. However, when we look at ad spending, both of the last couple of years and predicted for the next couple of years, you can see that it's steady, but is not spectacular and doesn't represent by any scope of the imagination the paradigm shift that we see in consumer behavior. Granted, when we look at digital, we do see double-digit ad spend growth in digital, driven predominantly by mobile. In fact, I think mobile is coming in around 38, 39% growth year on year. That said, the overall spend, when you look at these data points together, the overall spend means that advertisers aren't actually adding money, a huge amount of money into the pot to reflect the paradigm shift of consumer spending. So that kind of led to our first question, which was okay, what should I actually add more money into my advertising spend, or should I rob Peter to pay Paul, move money from traditional to digital and so on, other kinds of switches? That was our first question. And the first ground truth is this: advertising across platforms delivers higher ROI. The more platforms you're using, the better, effectively. So the average 2-platform campaign is 19% more effective in terms of ROI than the average single platform campaign. The average 5-platform campaign is delivers 35% more ROI than the average single platform campaign. And yet, when we look at the numbers, the figures in yellow here, which represent the percentage of campaigns on each of these numbers of platforms, you can see that just adding up the first couple here, that 29% plus 31%, 60% of campaigns are taking place on 2 platforms or less. So there's a very significant opportunity for advertisers to optimize their campaigns and add a platform. So that's our guideline here is add a platform. If you're advertising on 1, make it 2. If you're on 2, make it 3. So that's the first ground truth. And yet, if you look at the behavior of major advertising, many of them are very visibly stating that they're shifting money from traditional to digital. So that led to our second question: is what are those? Now we've established cross-platform is the way forward. What are those combinations of platforms, or indeed, are there any combinations of platforms that are particularly magical together? So the second ground truth focuses on those combinations. So the data here are indexed to a TV-only campaign. You can see that a print and TV combined campaign is 19% more effective than a TV-only campaign. Print obviously has unique attributes, not least its tactile nature. Radio plus TV campaigns are 20% more effective than TV-only campaigns. Radio obviously has the unique advantage of being very close to the purchase location in many occasions. When you look at digital and TV together, you see what we're calling a kicker effect, however, 60%. So the average digital and TV campaign is 60% more effective in terms of driving ROI than the average TV campaign. So that's our kicker effect and our second ground truth. Now there are significant differences by category there. Just to illustrate that, and I'm just going to pick on one digital tactic here. If you look at paid search, you see on the left-hand side the data pertain to lower involvement categories, and on the right you see higher involvement categories. I'm very aware this is a contentious description, and many people would categorize some of the verticals on the left-hand side as in fact being higher involvement. But broadly speaking, if you think of the categories on the left being ones that the verticals rather ones where there's a faster purchase cycle, a lower cost, lower risk to the consumer. Those are categories like food and beverage and household and so on. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see categories like pharma and travel, where there's a higher cost to the consumer, there's a higher risk potentially, and they're longer-term decisions. It makes so many of those purchase decisions. Anyway, long story short, if you look at paid search, for example, it's very hard to drive ROI with paid search, not only on its own but also in combination with TV in those lower involvement categories. Whereas for a higher involvement categories, you can see that not only is paid search very effective per se relative to TV, but also in combination with TV, the whole is very much greater than the sum of its parts. And this pattern applies basically across all digital tactics too. This is just one slide I wanted to share to illustrate the point that TV and digital synergy is more pronounced in higher involvement categories. So that's the second ground truth, that TV and digital are particularly magical together. The third question we were going to ask ourselves was, how do these findings differ by demographic? So if we look here, this is the optimal mix based on a large budget, $15 million per quarter across verticals. You can see that the optimal mix is 78%. And granted, this is a very broad brushstroke, 78% traditional and 22% digital. Now, we all hear the headlines around millennials only using mobile, and that's the way to connect with millennials. so on. In fact, in an earlier version of this deck, I had a slide which was giving voice to that exact header, which was we've all seen the headlines, and the slide took me about 30 seconds to put together because there are so many headlines in the trades around the fact that the millennials are only going to be reached by the newer types of platform like mobile. So one hypothesis might have been that this column might be flipped around. So you might see 70% on digital and only a small, relatively small percentage on traditional. However, if you look at the optimal mix for traditional and digital for millennials, you can see it's actually not that different. The optimal mix of traditional when you're trying to reach millennials is 71% and 29% for digital. One caveat or rider to that, we're all aware, everyone's on the phone is aware, there's a very big difference between an unmarried 18-year-old and a married 34-year-old with 3 kids. But insofar as people are still buying media based on these broad demographics, we thought the information was going to be pretty useful. The fourth question was how do I optimize, just a tiny question of how do I optimize my digital advertising, and we have a whole bunch of data which just ping Zena after this call and we can share it with you, a whole slew of data that we can share about the relative effectiveness of video versus display. And the relative effectiveness of mobile video versus desktop video. Long story short, video is more effective than display, and mobile is more effective than desktop. However, what we're focusing on here is frequency. Just looking at a few digital tactics here, you can see the massive amounts of spend here, and that kind of adds a little bit of context or light to the comments I made a second ago about video being more effective than banner. But you can see $6 billion spent on both desktop banner and desktop video, $4 billion on mobile video, and $17 billion this year spent on mobile banner. And yet one question we get asked a lot actually here at the ARF and our knowledge center is what is effective frequency? Since the 60s, there's been thinking around I think it's called the 3-hit rule, that 3 is the ideal number of impressions. It was developed by a guy called Krugman, I think, who used to work at General Electric in the 60s, and that was borne out by work that carried on through the 80s until some of the work around recency and shelf store came around a little bit later on. Anyway, it's a big question for a lot of advertisers, how much is too much. So that's what we are showcasing here. So the fourth ground truth is overinvesting can have diminishing returns and critically can cause sales to decline. So this is ComScore work that came out in November of last year, and what they did there was to look at conversions, to look at people going to a landing page further to seeing an advert. And basically, if you take it as a conceptual given here that the first impression is the most effective one, then what the chart here represents is at the 10th impression, you're having 40% of the impact of the first one. 20th impression, only 11%. 30th impression, 2%. And then by the time you get to the 40th impression within a month, you're actually harming your objective here. So the rule of thumb here, this is a very broad rule, but it's nevertheless one I think that we all think is valid because we know that some of the delivery levels are massive. The rule of thumb is basically 1 impression per day. Anything more than that, and you risk actually harming your brand. And this isn't the first time. This isn't the first time we've heard this kind of guidance. In fact, one of the gurus of, in fact, he's called the guru of media planning, Erwin Efron, the late Erwin Efron, said, "Don't get carried away." He said that frequency is a weed. Frequency is a kind of media crabgrass. So we know now that, and we've quantified that, the keeping hold or keeping track or managing frequency is a piece of or is a very low-hanging piece of fruit for advertisers, difficult though that might be on occasion. So the fifth question we asked ourselves was around about creative strategy. So we've established, obviously, that cross-platform reaps rewards, pays huge dividends here. The question then is, okay, what should my creative strategy be across platforms? We know creative is super important. The 75% of impact is determined by creative quality. This is Ipsos data. There are a number of other sources for this type of information, but basically it ranges between 60 to 80% depending on which source you look at. So, and it's interesting from my perspective here at the ARF, reading all these tens and tens of articles, these trades every day. So much of the focus is on media, and yet it can be ignored quite how important creative is. So the question then is, okay, now that we know it's super important, we know that cross-platform advertising works, what should my strategy be? Should I produce different, completely different pieces of creative for my TV and my digital and my mobile, my print, etc., or should I have exactly the same creative content on each of those platforms? So the fifth ground truth to answer those questions is this: a consistent, unified creative strategy delivers the strongest results. So we're looking at a unified campaign, unified customized campaign. I'll go into that in a second, versus the index here of non-unified. And what a non-unified campaign means is a campaign which happens to be advertising the same product or service, but is likely produced by different agencies and is not really linked in any way other than the thing or service that it's advertising. Whereas the column on the right here, which is showing close to 60% more impact, represents a unified and customized creative strategy. What that means is the messaging, the creative across those platforms is not necessarily exactly the same, but is very consistent in terms of characters, messaging, taglines, color, music, etc. So, a very good example that resonates with many people is the Toyota Swagger Wagon campaign from, I guess it must be 3 or 4 years ago. Where you had very different, you had slightly different executions. You had a 30-second TV spot, and you had a 1.5 or 2 minute spot on YouTube. So, but it all felt very similar. It was not disparate or not connected in any way. So that's our fifth ground truth: that consistency with customization delivers the strongest results. And there's a sister presentation to this one. In fact, it was if you remember earlier on the deck, I was talking about the 3 experiments. The second experiment focuses very much on, okay, that's great, but how do I do it exactly? How should I customize my creative for mobile, and how should I customize it for from a TV advert? So I dare say Zena is beavering away and figuring out a date for that presentation. So that will be well worth attending if you're interested in how to customize creative. So that's the fifth ground truth. A consistent unified strategy is the way forward. So to summarize, we asked ourselves 5 questions at the outset here. And the action steps, the smart spending action steps that we're suggesting here is, first of all, invest in multiple platforms. Don't rob Peter to pay Paul. Don't shift from one platform to another. Invest in multiples. Second, combine traditional and digital to maximize ROI. And that applies, broadly speaking, when you're trying to reach millennials also, not just about mobile. Fourth, get a hold of your frequency when it comes to digital and old media, but given some of the figures that we see in terms of over delivery, digital is one area of focus that advertisers could do well to look at. And then fifth, create a unified creative strategy across platforms. And the result, we think, can unlock $31 billion in the US. So looking at $196 billion estimated to be spent this year on advertising in the States. We think that by optimizing that ad spend to reflect the guidelines here, particularly the one about adding more platforms, then advertisers can effectively free up $31 billion in effective ad spending. So that's the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, time. I'm going to try and, I think I've already exposed myself as something of a technical learner here. So let me try and go back to the chat screen and we can see if we have any questions.
We're okay, Jasper. I do have some questions that came in. So regarding the TV and digital combination, are there other category views you can share?
Certainly, yeah. Yes, we do. We have learnings on there. I showed the one chart about paid search and TV combined for higher involvement and lower involvement categories in general. We do have category views for pharma, for household, for food and bev, for travel, and so on. The one thing we don't have there is finance, but my hypothesis it's going to behave pretty similarly to pharma. So if anyone would like category-specific views of the TV plus digital synergy, then just ping Zena and we'll get the deck across.
Next question. Did you look into how to sequence advertising across platforms?
We did. In fact, I mentioned a second ago that the sister presentation to this was focused on customizing. That was work done by Manuel Garcia and Horst Stitt, both here at the ARF, and presented alongside this work actually at Rethink of this year. Manuel then presented an audience measurement around about almost exactly a month ago now, his work on sequencing. And what that goes into is basically, okay, now I'm just using exactly the same creative across platforms, which is not what we advocate, but whatever. If I'm using exactly the same creative across platforms, what should my sequence be? And what should it be if I've actually customized? So he's got some really good learnings there that Zena will be happy to share the presentation of if you ping her after this chat.
Next question. I'm surprised that more campaigns aren't using multiple platforms, 3 or more. What kinds of industries are included?
It's 3,200 campaigns on that one particular chart. So it's a huge swathe of advertisers. That particular piece of data comes from analysis of analytic partners, what they call their ROI Genome project, and that is basically all of their client work anonymized. And if those of you that are not familiar with analytic partners, they're one of the leaders in the marketing mix modeling space and have been around for 12 or 13 years now. So the data that are in that database are very wide ranging, will represent local and national advertisers across pretty much every industry that you can think of. So it's a really interesting question. I think people are generally surprised at that. That said, I want to add a little bit of context. We were presenting this with a firm that focuses more on retail and CPG. And there was a question, in fact, as to whether we should show that chart because basically everyone in the audience was going to be advertising on one platform only. Which was interesting for me to hear, but it definitely bears out the point that it bears out the data rather. Those figures are a little bit surprising in terms of how many people are using, are maxing out, going up to 5 platforms.
Next question. Is the ROI percentage based on per dollar spent?
Yes.
Are there more details regarding the creative insights provided?
Yes, in the sister presentation that Zena can either share or Zena, are you going to be? Is that on the schedule to be presented, Manuel or Horst?
Manuel and Chris Bacon are both set to present later on in the year.
Do you know when Manuel's is?
I think it's on Neuro.
No, do you know when?
Oh, sorry. I can find the date before we conclude.
Okay, perfect. So I dare say it's going to be soon. So for the person who asked that question, and indeed anyone, it's a great presentation. Zena, why don't you could send that out, or you could just make sure everyone knows the date of that one. So yeah, there's lots of great work on customization that we've done over the last the last year and a half or so. So some good stuff.
Next question. Does it still make sense to invest in cross-platform if digitally is actually much better targeted? If you can target behaviorally or with specific shoppers digitally, wouldn't it make sense to spend more there?
Yeah, but it all depends on what your marketing goal is here, right? If you're only going after one specific segment, and you're not looking to build awareness in another segment, then that could be one tactic. Yeah, certainly. I want to make it very clear that these are the ground truths that we're showcasing here are general guidelines for the advertising industry. There are situations, whether it's because you're focusing on a very very specific segment, or your goal is only to drive X or Y type of behavior, when you might want to deviate from that and just focus on digital, and only when you're able to target a very specific segment of consumers. Broadly speaking, though, not least because of reach, I think as a general rule, the combination of platforms is a very valid guideline.
Someone asked if we will be posting a copy of this presentation. The presentation itself will not be posted, but what will be made available is the recording of this webcast. So it'll be...
There's a nuance there, Zena. This is available to all ARF members now.
Oh, okay. All right.
We'll figure out how to share that with you as effectively as possible.
Thank you. Next question. Low interest categories seem like they are not benefiting from a synergy. Can you expand on this, especially in categories like fuel and gas?
Great question. I think I've had a fuel and gas question before on this topic. So yeah, we'll in the larger deck or in the deep dive deck, we presented this twice at Rethink. Once on the main stage, which is the presentation you've seen today, and once in one of the smaller sessions. And I think the smaller session was where we showcased some more of the category views. Basically, yeah, just to confirm, the lower interest or lower involvement, or whichever term we want to use, the category, the less synergistic the TV and digital combination was. And the hypothesis that I went into this with was that it was all about information, basically. So, having seen those data, the more information the consumer was searching for, the more powerful that synergy was going to be. I think it went a bit beyond it, however. My thinking as to why it happens is that there are 5 or 6 kind of drivers of that synergy. First of all, definitely there are categories where information searching is critically important, and the TV and digital synergy is really high there. There are a couple of other reasons though. So if you think about pharma, I think it's a solid hypothesis that when a purchase is health related, I realize that fuel and gas isn't, but just indulge me. So it'll probably have relevance for others on the phone too. When something is health related, then that synergy is more pronounced. When the purchase is more reliant on recommendations, then you're going to see that synergy pop up as well. There are going to be things where, the more obvious ones where there's a significant risk or financial outlay to the consumer. So in category, for example, if you're buying a mortgage, or you're buying a credit card, or you're buying a vacation, or whatever it might be, you're spending a few grand, then you're likely to bolster your perceptions from TV advertising, for example, or radio or print, with some more detailed searching online. So fuel and gas, it's a really interesting one. I guess, I don't know if we have a category of view of that generally. I think it's a pretty solid hypothesis that would behave very similarly to food and bev and household, and perhaps even being further over to the left of those, if you imagine those on a column chart, further over to the left in terms of the TV plus digital synergy.
Next question. Are the ROI results all based on in-market sales or equity metrics?
They're all based on in-market sales, with the exception of the creative data, which is the 5th ground truth. Now that's based on Millward Brown data. The ground truth there was that a unified and customized strategy drives more impact. So the way they did that was they look at 3 metrics. There are 3 equity metrics which we rolled together to establish our impact measurement. From memory, one of the metrics there is awareness based. One of them is more about purchase intent, and one of them is around memory of features or something akin to that. So those 3 things were rolled together, but those were 3 equity metrics. That's the Millward Brown stuff, which underpins the creative finding.
Is there any additional information on other media, specifically radio, other than what was shown? If yes, how can I gain access to it?
I'm trying to think if there is. I think generally speaking, there is not. I think we've seen everything that there are nuances in here in terms of categories, and perhaps interestingly to many of you on the phone, that I did more than alluded to. I just mentioned it very quickly. Some of the findings on the relative effectiveness on video versus display and mobile versus desktop are really interesting. But I think we've seen all we have in terms of the impact of different platforms. That said, when it comes to developing creative and customizing creative and sequencing platforms, then the work that Manuel and Horst have done is definitely going to have a few more, I hesitate to say nuggets because I think they're bigger than that, boulders of insight for anyone who's interested in other platforms. But in terms of the ROI stuff, no, I think you've seen all she wrote in that respect.
Speaking of Manuel, the webcast that he has slated is for Wednesday, September 21st at 1 p.m. In case anybody wanted to register for that. The next question was, out of home a measure you looked at with viewing cross-platform synergy, or was it limited to broadcast and print?
Out of home was not included in most of the findings. I think there is one chart. I'm not going to rewind here on the phone. I think it's one chart where, so if you all remember the first ground truth, which was that more is better, basically. I believe that finding is based on a very wide swath of platforms. Where out of home does not feature is in the second ground truth, which is around the kicker effect. So you remember we had the data index to TV only. We had print plus TV, radio plus TV, and digital plus TV. We don't have out of home plus TV, but out of home does feature as a factor, as do a number of other platforms in the broader finding, which is that more platforms are better.
Is there a recommendation concerning a minimum budget per platform or medium?
Fantastic question. And the answer is no. In terms of this presentation, I'm being slightly facetious. It's a fantastic question. It's a very, very natural follow-on from this research. So as we're developing and crystallizing our research agenda here at the ARF, one aspect is what are the new things that we might want to go after that are out there in the industry, whether it be virtual reality or IoT or whatever it might be. But also the other aspect is, okay, what are the natural follow-ons from this research? Long story short, thresholds, as we've been calling them internally, is definitely one area that we think there's a lot of interest in. Because it's one thing to say, okay, thou shalt use TV and digital together if you want to drive 60% higher ROI. But if you're even within a big multinational, if you're a brand within a multinational corporate and your budget is country specific, then you're not talking about necessarily tens of millions of dollars per quarter. So it's a very fair question, and I think I know it's on, it's in contention for featuring as one of our next research projects.
Are there recommended weight levels per platform or media?
It's very similar to answer to the one I gave you a second ago.
When paid search is analyzed, did you break out branded versus generic terms?
I don't believe we did for this analysis. No. I think I have one. If the person who asked that question wanted to ping me offline, someone else may ask me this question. I have it response in my email. There's nothing in this data, but I do have a couple of insights into that behavior if someone wants to just ping me or Zena.
Okay. Will those weight levels vary based upon the number of commercial ad executions that are used?
Let me think about that. Will the weight levels? I'm assuming it's a follow-up to the question a second ago. Repeat the question again, Zena.
Will those weight levels vary based upon the number of commercial and ad executions that are used?
I guess the answer must be yes, but I'd have to think about it.
And our final question, are there any marketing attribution companies that you work with that you feel get it?
It's a great question, but I have to dodge it completely politically and practically. What I will say, there are many attribution and mix and single source companies who do fantastic work, much of which is featured on the ARF stages. So if you want the latest and greatest in attribution, single source, mix, mix and all that type of thing, then get in touch with our knowledge center. We've got some fantastic presentations of, the last this is our 80th year, so 80 years worth of presentations, but perhaps more relevantly, the ones over the last 4 or 5 years have seen leaps and bounds made in the attribution space. I'm using attribution with a lowercase a there. I mean, everything that pertains to ROI measurement. To add a little bit more specificity to the question, I think it's probably worth pointing out that the companies that we worked with on this project specifically were included, that responded to the RFPs and were analytic partners. They provided the data pertaining to the first and second findings, so the more is better finding basically, and the TV and digital finding. We also work with Marketing Evolution to establish some of the ground truth around the optimal mix for all adults versus millennials. Marketing Evolution also partnered with us to establish the ground truths on video versus display and mobile versus desktop, which are in the other deck, which I've mentioned a couple of times. Millward Brown, we leaned on them for the creative stuff, and then Comscore, I mentioned, was a partner for the effective frequency, or the finding pertaining to frequency. So those are just a few of the companies that we work with here, and obviously we had input from a whole bunch of others. You will have seen on that sponsors and partners slide, not least TiVo and Nielsen Consumer Neuroscience and all that type of stuff. So there are many wonderful vendors out there. If you want to see examples of their work, contact the Knowledge Center, and you can see some PowerPoints that have been on our stages.
Well, that will be it for today's presentation. Jasper, thank you so much for taking the time to present Crossplatform's How Advertising Works presentation. And like Jasper said, if you want copies of this presentation or any scheduling for the future How Advertising Works webcasts, please contact me. I'm at zena@thearf.org. That's ZENA at thearf.org. Thank you, everybody, for spending your lunch hour with us, and I'll hope to see you for the next webcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.